That's great.
She's the one who's going to talk to the microphone.
That's great.
So it's 45 minutes for each part, so the warning should be...
Yeah, and I actually told Sedina maybe 40 minutes. Okay? Yes. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Oh no, oh no. All right. We still have a stream of people coming in, so 30 seconds. All right, I think we should get going. I know people will continue to come in from yoga and lunch and the movie, but I hope everyone had a good break and you're all feeling a bit refreshed and have some more energy for this wonderful afternoon session. My name is Marie Studer. I'm Senior Advisor for the Planetary Health Alliance and the Johns Hopkins Institute for Planetary Health, and so delighted to see everyone here and to also open this afternoon's sessions. Before I introduce our moderator for the next session, I just want to make a quick announcement because we've been asked about recordings for the sessions, and I've been informed that within a month after the annual meeting session, recordings will be published through the Planetary Health Alliance's YouTube account. They will also be available through that FAM or PHAM 2025 page on the PHA website. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay updated, but of course we will also, I'm sure, be doing a lot of announcements on social media and through our newsletter and so on. So recordings will be available, we hope, as soon as they can be. And so now it is really my honor to introduce the next session of the day, which is De-risking Planetary Health, Driving the Transition in an Uncertain World. This is, we know that planetary health change and the great transition requires big, large-scale systemic change. It requires applying new frameworks, new thinking, new partnerships, and often financing or making that kind of change feels a bit risky in traditional senses. And so today we're going to be really looking at what are the roles of banks, of private and public funding, regulatory mechanisms, and so on, that can be utilized or rethought to make it a little less risky to invest in the work that we need. This is a two-part session. So the first 40 minutes or so, we'll be looking at a large-scale global perspective on this concept. And then the second 45 minutes, we're going to transition the team and the speakers, and we'll be really looking at a more of a case study, if you will. So it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this first part of the session, Sedina Fall. Sedina Fall is a senior lecturer in finance at Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business and co-faculty director of practice for the Johns Hopkins Institute for Planetary Health. His professional background includes leadership in real estate and valuation consulting, and his work often focuses on the future of cities, and just led a Planetary Health Cities session upstairs during the last breakouts. And this work includes delivery of public infrastructure projects in both developed and emerging markets. His teaching explores issues of project financing, including public-private partnerships, economic development, investing in resilience to address climate-related challenges, and the use of technology to improve new infrastructure and to make old infrastructure more efficient. Welcome, Sedina.
Okay, so investing in planetary health infrastructure carries risk. It's difficult to get banks, whether they're private banks, investment banks, public funding institutions, it's difficult for them to get visibility in terms of long-term returns. Also, the regulatory environment shifts all the time. So it's a difficult investment case to make. I see two scenarios, I would say, post-COVID. Scenario number one is what I call a gray recovery. So not a green recovery, a gray recovery. That's the dystopian world where what we get is higher prices. We get more pressure on our natural resources. So this is the business as usual case. Nothing really changes. Higher prices, more pressure on natural resources, more demographic pressures globally, higher government debt, less habitability of our planet. Natural resources concentrated in more and more, in fewer hands, both in terms of countries, but also in terms of corporations. Everyone's fighting for resources. So that's the dystopian scenario that investing in planetary health infrastructure would be very difficult. The other scenario is one that's, hopefully that's where we're headed, where governments, institutions, business communities, citizens they're much more aware of the extreme fragility of our economic, social, and natural systems. They're fragile, they can break, and therefore, they would work hard to reduce the risk. How do we do that? Maybe regaining sovereignty over your natural systems, your supply chains, this whole idea of reshoring could be one way to do that. Another way to do that is coming up maybe with a resilience index that would measure the risk of the Anthropocene, investing in today's times. You can also have a scenario where a tax system to finance this transition towards a green recovery instead of a gray recovery is in place. So with that backdrop, I'd like to introduce our panelists who are all on Zoom. Andy Valenciano Yamuni is the CEO of Democracia Plus. He's calling us all the way from Colombia. And then we've got Vera Siesjö. I apologize if I mispronounce the last name, Vera. Senior health scientist with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So my first question, I'll start with Vera first. What brings you to this moment?
Thank you so much, Serena, and thank you to the whole Planetary Health Alliance community. I so wish I would be there in person with you, but very happy to be here likewise. I think what brings us here is the sort of the reality that you alluded to at the beginning, Serena. I think we have the choices, and I sit at the newest development bank in the world. We're about 10 years old with a clear focus on infrastructure. And when we started to look at how we can do what we call infrastructure for tomorrow, that means that we really need to look at the intersection between climate, health, and nature. And as we started to think about it, we always said that infrastructure is a critical necessity for a lot of low and middle income countries that have huge and urgent needs of critical infrastructure, roads, energy, housing, hospitals, and so forth. But we know that the way that we have built these ones over the years have not been many times a very sustainable way, maybe alluding to the kind of the gray recovery, as you were saying. So our challenge was really to look at how can we really take this as a challenge and try to rethink, the paradigm of infrastructure financing, and how can we really sort of optimize infrastructure to be able to look at every piece of infrastructure to really build in and build together both climate mitigation and adaptation, nature conservation and restoration, and real kind of move from the sort of co-benefits to core benefits in health in all of our infrastructure projects. So we really took that as a challenge upon ourselves, and we started to really think deeply about this, and we came out with a couple of reports, which is our flagship reports. The first one was on the net zero transition, so really trying to see how we can facilitate that moonshot for the emerging world. The one we did last year was on nature as infrastructure, so really redefining, what infrastructure is, and really thinking of nature as most essential and critical infrastructure that we have, and how can we invest more in that. And the last one that we came out with last year was on infrastructure for planetary health. So we were sort of saying to close the triangle, but really think critically about how we can enable a paradigm shift that looks at health, climate, and nature conservation and restoration in all infrastructure projects. It's not an easy challenge, and I think you also mentioned that it's a hard shift for a lot of sectors that may not think naturally about health. When you talk to engineers, or may not think about nature when you talk to health people, and vice versa. But maybe that's the silver lining with climate change. It forces us to rethink, where we are and where we need to go. So that's kind of what brings me to this conversation, with a deep gratitude to the Alliance, who has really served as inspiration for the work that we have done in this space.
Fantastic. Thank you, Vera. So, Andy, same question to you. What brings you to this conversation?
Well, good afternoon, Sedina. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for the invitation as well. I would have loved to be there. I have to do this remotely from Colombia. But so my approach to this is from different perspectives. I was once a policymaker in Costa Rica as Minister of Trade, and coming from a country that has longly and deeply valued the environment and the protection of the environment, I worked bringing investment, promoting exports, creating jobs, but always with this underlying issue of how does our economic development model actually supports our environmental ambition. And then fast forward a few years, I then worked from the UN at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, supporting countries address some of the underlying challenges that they're facing when they have this, on one end, very high levels of debt, and at the other end is very high levels of ambition for climate, environmental, and planetary health goals, and how are those two being faced at each other. So thinking about those issues is what brings me today, and just to provide some perspective on some of the challenges that you were mentioning, Sedina, and that Marie at the initial remarks mentioned. When I'm saying that governments around the world and countries around the world, especially developing countries, are having a hard challenge figuring out how to create the fiscal space to be able to address those very high levels of ambition that we're demanding of countries around the world on how to increase their environmental goals, their planetary health goals. We see that nowadays, and just to provide some perspective, and then we can give you more information, but we have now developing countries owing almost $30 trillion of debt. Mm-hmm. That's way more than the pandemic. So this goes more into your gray scenario. This means that 3.4 billion people, that's almost half of humanity, are actually living in countries that spend more on interest payments than on health or education. So I think the problem that we see now is we're kind of in that gray scenario that you're mentioning, at least when we're talking about like the levels of debt and the low fiscal space that developing countries are having, which at the end of the day is a binding constraint to do all the other ambitious goals that you have been speaking in this morning and obviously in the last few years around planetary health. So that's where I'm coming from. I want to stop here, but just to say that we have very, very difficult challenges ahead when it comes to bringing more investment, particularly to developing countries, but it is possible. So looking forward to speaking more about it on the follow-up questions.
Fantastic. I think we should have a little poll at the end, gray or green recovery, and see where people stand. I think that'd be an interesting statistic to look at. But so Vera, I'm going to come to you. What role does the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and other similar institutions play in de-risking investments? Building pipelines that link conservation, climate adaptation, and public health, ensuring all the good things we want, nature-positive projects that deliver measurable impact on the ground. So what role do institutions play, institutions like yours, in this potential endeavor? And I really want you to focus on the de-risking piece. Any ideas about de-risking?
Well, thank you, Sedina. I think everyone has an important role, but I think development banks have a very important role because of the nature of the work that we do and also the members that we serve. And I would say, we are at the early stages of this, but there are many ways that, we can work together with philanthropies, work together with concessional financing that sit in-house in our institutions, work together with private sector and other financial institutions. And I think there's several different tools that can be used, and many of them are unfortunately quite underutilized, but it goes from sort of the scale of blended financing, which is what I described before, where, for example, we look at specific project where we see an opportunity in a member state investing in a specific project, and where we have an opportunity to collaborate with partners that we are accredited for, such as the Green Climate Fund or the Pandemic Fund or other philanthropic funding, where we can basically utilize different types of financing streams to build up more innovative projects. Because many times what unfortunately is lacking is that there's limited capacity even within development banks to really look at and scaling up these projects that are quite new and where there's a lot of uncertainty, what the outcomes will be. It hasn't been tested before, it hasn't been tried before, but we need that space to innovate and try new solutions. So I think by partnering with organizations and institutions that we can sort of jointly come together in different financing stream is one part. I think there's obviously guarantees that development banks can provide, and those can be different types of guarantees that will allow different types of financing to have sort of a buffer or a safety net to make sure that, other lenders are more sort of interested in going into more riskier sort of investments. And I think it's important to remember also that when we look at a lot of these things that we are really trying to do now, it is nature-based solutions that have clear health outcomes. It's the lack of valuation of nature that many times is the problem. So how do we actually measure? How do we actually make sure that nature solutions or nature-based solutions or nature as infrastructure have a sort of a clear return on investments for different investors? I would also say that we have a clear role to be able to work on different types of, there could be bonds, for example. Mm-hmm. We have provided different types of blue bonds when it comes to ocean conservation with clear health co-benefits and also climate mitigation adaptation measures and so forth. So bonds are another way that we can also finance, more trickier type of investments or newer type of investments. We haven't done ourselves, but there's also a lot of bonds that are specifically around everything from keystone species, where we also know that there's important health outcomes and ecosystem service outcomes that are incorporated into those models. So I think those are, just a few things that I think we could use as sort of financial tools. But in reality, it comes down to, in my mind at least, we really need to kind of educate, different sectors. We need to come together with different sectors to really sort of outline the priorities and why these things come together and how we can work in a more intersectoral approach. I started the discussion saying that, we need to talk to engineers that are not necessarily used to talking about health. So we need to talk to nature conservation people that are not thinking about health, or we need to talk to different sectors. And I think when we launched this report, Infrastructure for Planetary Health, I sort of made a pledge. Maybe I'm not fulfilling it in this session here, but I said, I will sort of preach to the unconverted, talk to people who are beyond the healthcare sector, the planetary healthcare sector, in a sense, because I think we need to really sort of reach out to other sectors and have these conversations and not only keep them amongst ourselves. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Vera. So, Andy, I'm going to go to you. I want to stay sort of in the macro sphere still. Let's give a little bit more time to this discussion of high debt burdens. Everyone knows that. Unfinished investment in climate agendas that look nice on paper, but the implementation is lacking. Unwillingness or inability to raise taxes to finance those. So what has to happen to channel infrastructure money and crowd in private investors for planetary health?
Thank you, Sabina. Well, going back to the point that I mentioned about, having a lot of developing countries with very limited fiscal space, I think the first thing that needs to happen is what was discussed recently at the Finance for Development conference in Seville that happened a few months ago, in the sense that there is a global understanding that the international financial institutions like development banks, we need to have quicker, fairer debt restructuring processes. We need to rechannel unused funding, for example, from the IMF on the special drawing rights. But more importantly, and this goes along the lines of what Vera was saying, is the expansion of the multilateral development banks' lending capacity through hybrid mechanisms like the ones that Vera described. This is absolutely critical for several countries that really need that breathing space in order to be able to channel more funding. Otherwise, we're basically pushing them on a very unfair trade-off of having to basically pay off interests versus having the space to do the investments on critical things like infrastructure, health, education, environment, etc. So that's first on the macro level. But then once you go step down, and this is still work that needs to be done on with the MDBs and with other multilateral institutions, which is we need to work more on what the Global Environmental Facility particularly has said around policy coherence. And this is basically to ensure that all these efforts and the policies that are being worked on reinforce each other and not contradict one another. So what do I mean by that? Right now, a lot of the efforts are done in silos. You have a lot of development banks working on the environmental agenda, and they're talking to the ministers of environment. And they do a lot of effort around the environmental agenda to channel more resources for conservation, for sustainability, mitigation. But then the rest of the ministries and the rest of the agenda, the development agenda on the countries are walking in the other direction. Mm-hmm. So it becomes like having a single drop in an ocean, because you have these development models that are still having, let's say, a lot of incentives and actually providing fiscal resources to do what you describe as the business as usual. So how do we work on the multilateral level for that policy coherence is absolutely critical. And then we can't ask everything out of development banks and the international finance organizations, there has to be a homework to be done by governments to fix what is called the enabling environment. And that's basically, if we want to attract more international resources, whether it's private capital, whether it's development banks, when we're talking about de-risking, at the end of the day, finance, money, capital, what they don't like is uncertainty. We need more clarity from the ground up, meaning clarity on standards, on regulations, on tariffs, on permits, that create that enabling environment that is unfortunately missing in many developing countries, where we're not going to be able to, change the international finances institutions' incentives to move into, let's say, a new space like planetary health, if we don't have a clear understanding of what it means, what are the standards, the regulations, again, tariffs, the local conditions that enable that crowding in effect of international finance that is needed. So it has to do with the macro, as we were saying. It has to do with how we create more innovative financial mechanisms. Vera mentioned like debt for nature swaps, blue bonds, blended finance mechanisms, all that are trying to integrate different agendas, the environmental, the health, the job creation agendas. But at the same time, we need local governments to really step up and create the conditions around what it means to invest in planetary health and send a clear signal that the rules of the game will remain over time, so we can attract more capital to really bring in the investment needed to these ambition goals that we have around the health and the climate agenda.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to ask you guys each one question, and then we'll open it up, because I'm sure folks have some thoughts on this. Where I'm from, which is Senegal, in West Africa, I can tell you that this current generation, multilateral development banks don't really have a great reputation. We can go into this ad nauseum, but the issue of effectiveness of their investments, how effective they are on the ground, is becoming, a big thorn on their side. So, Vera, my question to you is about exactly that. Can you share some concrete examples on your seat there, at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, concrete examples of how multilateral development banks are investing in a way that is more effective on the ground?
Thank you, Sedina, and well taken your comments. I think, we have to learn from the past, and we have to learn what has worked and what has not worked. And I would start by saying that no one sits on, the final solution. It's really important to collaborate, and that MDBs also collaborate with local partners, with other institutions, to really kind of both get a deeper understanding from the work on the ground in a lot of these member countries, but also really to solidify the work sort of continuing onwards. But I think one example I want to provide, and a little bit to Andy's thinking around, how do you actually create sort of policy landscape that allows for a better type of investment frames. So a lot of countries now have country platforms when it comes to climate investment. So it's basically, a sort of a framework that has been created by countries, on their investment priorities in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation. That is an infrastructure or framework that is being provided by the countries to sort of streamline different type of investments and different types of lendings and financing streams from different institutions. We're both talking about multilateral development banks, but also very important public development banks that sit in each country. I think that's also really important to not forget about them and, the important role that they have to play in this. I want to take one example that kind of came out of a new financial instrument that we launched last year, which is called climate policy-based lending. So it's basically provision of lending that we provide to countries. And in return for that lending, they have to put forward or select what is in their pipeline in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation policy strategies that they want to have legislated. And why I think this is an important piece is that when this came out, this was, as you can hear by the title, it was a climate policy-based financing tool. And a little bit out of my own frustration that we didn't have such thing for health, I was thinking that wouldn't this be the perfect way to actually incorporate a sort of larger set of a planetary health policy-based lending instead. And we were lucky enough to work together with one of our members, Brazil, who already have a country platform, which is a very well-developed platform to basically streamline different types of investments for their climate agenda. And what we did in that is that we provided now, in the process of providing a lending that both tackles sort of upstream policy changes in climate mitigation adaptation. So we look at industrial policies, carbon markets, but we also look at nature, conservation and restoration. So in this case, much around mangrove restoration and conservation, but also deforestation. And then in the third part, we look at health. So here we're supporting a larger set of policies that Brazil is putting in place for its national healthcare system, which is one of the biggest healthcare systems in the world. And this plan is called Adaptação. So it looks at both climate mitigation and adaptation. And why I think this is an important thing, and why I realize in this process why it's an important thing, it may not be that it's the actual funding that is important. Brazil already had, they were in the making of this plan. But what this enabled, this kind of joint sort of lending facility enable was for the finance ministries to talk to the health ministries, and the health ministries to talk to the environmental ministries, and the environmental ministries to talk to other sectors. And I think that really kind of forced these different line ministries to talk to each other, to know about each other's work, to be informed that, well, climate policy is actually health policy, and health policy is, well-planned health policy is climate policy. So I think that is one example that I think really kind of outlines of how we can together work to sort of shape better integration, where we also allow for different line ministries to talk to each other. And I think this is a good way where we can also optimize the climate financing. I mean, I think in 2023 we had about 125 billion US dollars in climate financing among MDBs, and that was almost a double figure since 2019. But only about 6% of that adaptation funding was going for anything related to health, and I think less than 1% was actually of the overall financing went for any type of financing that was health related. So it's also like, how do we optimize climate financing to have real outline targets for health and nature conservation? And I think that's where we can really have a print. This was just one project, but I think this model of actually rethinking through a larger lens, not health in a silent sector and climate and health in a silent sector, but really thinking through the larger climate financing lens and incorporating health solutions. I think that's one example.
Very good. Thank you, Vera. So, Andy, you've got about 4 minutes. I want to ask you a Latin America specific question, right? So Latin America has been experimenting with different ways of channeling resources into planetary health, not only through government, but also via, obviously, development banks, civil society. Can you share some concrete examples of how this is being done in your part of the world?
Sure, Sedina. Before I give you a couple of examples, I think it's important to understand that this is a whole of society approach, in the sense that, yes, we need the development banks, but we also need the governments, we already mentioned, creating the clear rules of the game. But philanthropy can play a big role in this, because as we have already mentioned, planetary health might be new to a lot of actors. It might be seen as a risky investment. So when you start with the governments and they set the rules of the game and they create that certainty, there's still some piloting to do. There might not be evidence. So that's when philanthropic organizations can take on early experimental stage investments, basically to create data, create new evidence, that then you have the development banks come in with, making those projects that might still be risky, safer enough for private capital. And then you have the private sector, which needs to be brought into this discussion. There needs to be a lot of learning about how they understand risk and then how we can frame planetary health projects to make it attractive for banks, pension funds, and even local businesses that are the ones that can really eventually scale once the groundwork is done. But in Latin America, I'll give you just a couple of examples of interesting things that have been happening. One, where I'm at right now in Colombia, in Medellin, a few years ago, they launched this Green Corridors project, which basically, was the idea of how do we create, more avenues, more public space with shaded, vegetated pathways in what was considered one of the city's hottest and most polluted areas. And the investments have now reduced temperatures around like 2 degrees. They have improved their quality. They have created safe green spaces that promote physical and mental health. And this was started by a local government. But then it created, again, the evidence, it set the rules of the game, and then it attracted a lot of the other actors that I mentioned into this type of project. So that's a very small, concrete project. There are others that try to tackle this issue around debt that I've mentioned. For example, Ecuador, a couple of years ago, created the largest debt for nature swap in, I think it was 2023. This was around $1.6 billion of sovereign debt that was swapped for a new financial mechanism that will start to generate revenue out of conservation. Basically, by protecting marine ecosystems, it will help with tourism, it will help with fisheries, it will help with carbon sequestration, it will help with local diets. And this was a partnership, and that's why I mean a whole of society approach. This was the Ecuadorian government with the Inter-American Development Bank, the DFC from the US, plus international NGOs, local NGOs partnering together to create this platform and serve as an example that there is a lot of innovation that can be done to reduce sovereign debt, to create mechanisms that provide new financing for conservation, for marine ecosystems, for a healthier environment that benefits all. But again, 2023, this was the largest one. I think the world needs way more ambition to be able to reach the level of challenges that we have ahead of us. But I think these smaller examples that I mentioned, for example, around Medellin, where that was a city level, a lot can be done. I think we're going to hear now in the next panel a conversation around another creative way in which cities and governments around the world are thinking on how to integrate all these variables. But I think, again, having this whole of society approach that has policy coherence, that allows us to align the incentives, reduce the risk, provide certainty for private capital to be brought in, requires a lot more actors to be brought into the table. And like Vera was saying, we need to do more of that, of preaching into the unconverted to make sure that they understand the benefits, the impact, and the value there is in investing in planetary health.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andy. I can tell that you're a pro. You answered the question and did the transition to the next session. I got to learn from you. But thank you to Andy. Thank you to Vera. This has obviously been a very rich conversation. For my 2 cents, I would just say that taxation to finance the transition and also finance de-risk infrastructure investment should also be on the table. But I guess that's a conversation for another panel. Thank you, and looking forward to talking some more.
We're going to hold the questions, I think, until after this. So Vera and Andy, I don't know, oops, they've disappeared, but they're still online, I think. If they can stay around through the next 40 minutes or so, then maybe we can open up to questions to all of the panelists. But in the meantime, I would like to transition now to our second part of the panel, and I'd love to invite the speakers to come up and while I introduce our moderator, Zach Taylor. So Zach Taylor is an academic lead at Resilient Delta, a joint initiative of the Delft University of Technology, Erasmus University, and the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. In this role, Zach helps to bring science, policy, and practice together to identify climate adaptation, finance needs, and solutions for the Dutch Delta. In addition, Zach is an assistant professor of urban development management at Delft University of Technology, and his research on finance and urban climate risks has been featured in the New York Times, The Economist, C40 Cities, and the Urban Land Institute. Welcome, Zach.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's good to be here. And it's interesting, I'm going to stay up here for at least the time being, but that our colleagues have what in the Netherlands we call polder. You have grouped together solidaristically on the stage. So that's funny. So thank you for the introduction. For the second half of the session, I have the privilege of bringing this conversation about the link between finance and planetary health back here to the Netherlands. The Dutch have a curious saying, the government will keep our feet dry. Many of you may know that much of the Netherlands is low-lying or even below sea level, including where we sit now. And there's a long and remarkable tradition of water management here, with water safety in particular being coded into the culture, landscape, laws, and institutions in what I find unique and remarkable ways as an outsider. Water safety, defined by publicly guaranteed protection standards and realized through large-scale infrastructure works, integrated with spatial planning and land use and urban development, is in many ways the foundation of the broad social and economic prosperity that defines the Netherlands today. So here, the Dutch case is really illuminating and interesting, in particular how water safety is financed. As you heard in the prior session, mobilizing finance for the transitions we face is more urgent than ever, yet many of the ambitions are not being realized at the pace we need in our dynamic and uncertain world. So in that case, I think the Dutch context offers food for thought and maybe a little inspiration about the role of public institutions and public and private cooperation to finance quite ambitious and remarkable water goals with very broad societal co-benefits. So here I have a few friends and colleagues that I'm excited to share the stage with. From the National Delta Program, we have Martijn Looijer, who's the financial and economic advisor to the Delta Commissioner, and I'll explain who that is in a moment. From the NWB Bank, we have Hielke van der Aa, sustainability analyst and researcher. From the cooperative insurer Unive, we have Hendriks, also a sustainability officer. And from Erasmus University, we have Siobhan Airy, assistant professor of transnational public law and governance, I think it is. So let's dive in. Martijn, the National Delta Program plays a unique strategic role in securing a long-term vision and strategy for water safety. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the program is and how it sits in a broader public institution landscape that's responsible for making sure water safety gets financed?
I can at least try to. Thank you, Zach, for this question. And thank you for being here, all of you. For the Netherlands, I think especially flood safety is an existential quest. If we didn't have any dikes and dams, there wouldn't be the Netherlands. It's like 60% of our area is in a flood-prone area. So, well, that is what we do. We do have a Delta program, which is like the strategic long-term direction for flood safety, but also for the drought, to have a fresh water availability, and for urban planning in a more of a good way to do so. flood nuisance, what we call. And the Delta program is a collaboration between local governments, municipalities, water authorities. They do that for over 1,000 years already. National governments, of course, and with a firm basis of science, I think. For instance, the universities like yours and yours. That's a good way to start off with. But we don't actually finance ourselves projects. That's what the water authorities, they do have the half of the financing, and they raise their own revenues and taxes, and they invest in the projects. And the other half is the Dutch Delta Fund, which is actually not a real fund as financing people recognize a fund. It's more of one of the chapters of the central budget. It's fiscal instrument. It's 10 years of our budget. And so there it is. You have the Delta Commissioner who sets direction, Delta Fund that provides a stable basis to invest on, and the water authorities and Rijkswaterstaat who all just deliver projects on the ground. And that is something we report on every Little Prinsjesdag, Little Princess Day. It was a couple of weeks ago, and we in this report we publish the direction, our own priorities, and we showed the way to go. And I think one other aspect is that this whole system provides like a long-term water management, and it incorporates short-term policy, politician focus. It's both of those worlds. But in total, it's somewhat less political than a lot of other things the government does. And I think that's for the Netherlands, well, that's a good thing, I believe.
Can you say just a little bit more about the Delta Commissioner as a sort of figurehead? I think that's an interesting feature.
Yeah, the Delta Commissioner is an institution as well as a person. And I think this is the first Delta Commissioner we have now. His name is Kover Daas, and he's appointed by the Crown, and he has like 6-year terms. So that is a little bit beyond the normal cabinet periods we do have. Yeah, these are 2 years, mostly 4. But the institution, well, I think it dates from Hurricane Katrina as an origin. When Katrina hit New Orleans, the people in the Netherlands, the politicians in the Netherlands were asking themselves, can we stay here? And they installed the second Delta community. The first one was after the floods in '53. The second one was given the task to answer the question, well, can we stay here? And they said, well, yes, but we have to do something. And that was when the Delta Commissioner as an institution was born. And a lot of other stuff I already spoke about.
Thanks a lot. I think we'll come back to you for sure with some questions about how that works, but it's good to pivot now to Hielke. Could you please tell us a little bit about the NWB Bank and what your purpose is as both one of the largest banks in the Netherlands, but also a public bank?
Yes, thanks, Zach. I'll be happy to do so. So the NWB Bank, we were founded in the 1950s by the water authorities, which were already introduced by Martijn. And the water authorities are a regional government. We have 21 of them in the Netherlands, and they're quite a typical institution for the Dutch water sector. And they founded a bank together to ensure the availability of affordable debt. So in that sense, the NWB Bank has financed some major developments in the water sector, especially regional flood defenses, but also, for instance, the development of wastewater treatment and infrastructure. And over the years, we have started to finance a lot of more public sectors, for instance, social housing, but also healthcare and utilities, for instance. And we have really a focus on public organizations, public institutions, public sectors. And in that way, we can provide debt at interest rates much lower than the commercial banks can, which is, I think, quite helpful so that our public sectors don't need to pay for the profit maximization of some of the bigger commercial banks. We are quite known for our, well, sustainability profile. So we were a front runner in ESG or sustainability bonds about 10 years ago. And we do a lot of sustainability reporting and commitments. And one of the sustainability teams we are, well, that is really close to our heart, I would say, is climate adaptation. One of the obvious reasons is our historical context of the water authorities, but I think it also derives from our concerns for the future, and then obviously the future of the public sectors and the public at large.
Thanks, Hielke. And I think one of the really interesting things here is you are an interface between international capital markets and these 21 public entities which are run by democratically elected groups of people. So I find that a very unique kind of institutional setup and a key one. Can you say something off the top of your head? What kind of figures are we talking about?
Oh yeah, good question. So I think we're the 5th largest bank in the Netherlands. Balance sheet of about 80 million euros. And I think half of that is in social housing and about 10 billion euros in the Dutch water sector.
Thanks, that's super interesting, thank you. All right, let's keep going to Harold. So a question to you about, we've talked about public finance, but what about insurance and specifically private insurers? So in this super well-organized public sector system for approaching water, what is the role of private insurers in the water system? And specifically, I'd love to hear more about Unive, which is a cooperative insurer, which is interesting in that context also. Can you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, thank you so much. Unive is the 4th biggest property and casualty insurer of the Netherlands, but it's the only one who is still acting as it was a mutual cooperation. And that means that we have 8 regional Unives all over the country. And also we have more than 100, and we call it insurance shops, where you can walk in and you can have a personal contact with the people, and you can have a very good expertise about what you really need in terms of insurance. And it also makes sure that this personal contact is also a very good way of knowing what is on the head of the member, because once you are walking in and you buy in fire insurance with this regional company, you are a member of the Unive, which means that you have the possibility to become a member of the member council, which is a very important advisory body which cannot be neglected. So once you buy an insurance, you have some influence in the strategy. And you also have some influence in how the products will look like. You have influence in what kind of strategy is in place towards the investments. And that's a very unique selling point, which is becoming more and more appreciated in this world where all the financial institutions are even withdrawing the direct contact. So, of course, we use artificial intelligence, but we don't use it to neglect the personal contact. Now, this is just to make a summarize of everything we spoke with the personal people. So if you're do you not like the chat boxes anymore, you're very welcome in each and every Unive shop in your neighborhood. And this model is working perfectly, especially when you have some changes to make in terms of sustainability. Because now we know what is exactly in place and what kind of challenges are in a very regional level. So we know the challenges which are sector-based, because we are a agriculture-based insurance company. We also know what the challenges are in the neighborhood in a very, very local level. And also we know what the challenges are in a region base. So which province is the most vulnerable one if you speak in terms of climate change or other sustainability-related topics?
Super helpful. All right. Siobhan, last but certainly not least. So you're a scholar, a legal scholar, with a keen interest in climate finance and arrangements around the world. And like me, a relative newcomer to the Netherlands and curious about how things work here. So what strikes you as novel about how things are organized in the Netherlands?
Thanks, Zach. And it's lovely just listening to my companions, discussions and presentations again. To me, there's kind of two parts that really strike me as being significant. One is a contextual one, and then the other is kind of the institutional side. I think the contextual side is Dutch people just take it for granted that they're going to be dealing with water and the risk of flooding, and that they've always done that. And indeed, they have done for hundreds and hundreds of years. Going back to the Middle Ages, monasteries, believe it or not, were key to kind of animating local kind of responses. So there's a strong history of kind of community, I'll call it community collaborative. Historians here would accuse me of anachronism, please forgive me. But, do you know what I mean there? In other words, like community-led kind of responses. And I think that long history kind of, in one way, flips to like a long view of the future. The work we do now is going to make a difference to future generations. And I think that longer term perspective is just implicit, I think, in how the Dutch approach responding to water. And it's not just 10, 20 years, it's 50, 100. And I think that's, not typical, right, in other countries. Another contextual feature I would just think is for me, struck me, was the kind of implicit value of like collective responses to flooding and risks from water is for the common good. And in fact, almost it's a public good. We are doing ourselves a favor, obviously, but it's also in our public interest to work together to do this. And for me, those kind of implicit contextual features then are revealed in the legal and institutional kind of arrangements that we have. As you were saying, there, Martijn, in 2010, you can think of it like Katrina, after the financial crash, at the Netherlands level, the political leadership at the time made the decision to create new institutions and new funding mechanisms to kind of ensure that the Dutch national response to dealing with flooding would be longer term, more predictable, more stable, and perhaps less at the whim of political, the vagaries of political ideas and stuff. And at this moment in time, like even just 15 years later, when we see that at the political level, there are, movements to challenge climate science and all the rest of it there, I think that was an incredible foresight for somebody that now lives here. But I think, to me, and the same with Hielke's, thing with the bank, which is a national bank, a public bank, and we have water, authorities at the region, at the subnational level. We have excellent examples, and they're not perfect, right? Okay, but we have really good examples of public innovation. And at a time when we've just, the previous speakers are looking at like how can we leverage, how can we respond innovatively? I think perhaps the Dutch are a little not shy, but they just take this for granted, that at the public level, public institutions can be incredibly innovative, protect and elaborate on the public interest, and that it works. I think finally I would just say, in terms of the financing side, taxation plays a huge role. And again, to me, I would frame that as a public, response to risk. In other jurisdictions, we have very much a private-led model, right? So people buy insurance to protect their homes, et cetera, et cetera. And that certainly happens here as well. But from the point of view as a country, as a jurisdiction, those would be some features I'd pick out.
Thanks, Siobhan. Super elegantly said. I want to switch back to Martijn. So we're aware that climate risks are growing. Rising seas, obviously a concern here. Also changes in extremes of rainfall, river flows. Drought is obviously a major concern. Salination. There are many intersecting climate issues on the horizon of the Delta program. And at the same time, the Dutch system is organized around, for example, safety standards, among other goals. And a lot of effort goes into maintaining infrastructure, to building new infrastructure to maintain those standards. And I know a lot of progress has been made to think about that future and bring it into the core programming. So what are some of the investment needs, and is the money there? And will we find it?
Yeah, well, thank you for this. Is the $1 million question. It literally is, isn't it? Yeah. And thank you for your kind words. It always helps to have somebody from the outside looking to the inside. I mean, I don't look at it like that. It's as well as you guys do. I take it for granted. Yeah, you're right. Climate is changing. We can measure it. And for the work I do on this side of I'm a climate adaptation or mitigation. I'm totally on the adaptational side. I don't do anything on mitigation. And that's where we do have the political space they allow us to operate. The colleagues from the mitigation side, that's a different story. But on our side of the world, we'll be fine. We can just implement measures as planned. And I think there's a lot that needs to be done. We've got pretty strict standards for flood safety. And these standards are based not on the question how high must we raise the dike, but it's based on how safe do we want people behind the dike to be. And that's calculated into a design of the dike in the end. And those are different for every region in the Netherlands, since there's different parts, different levels of economy behind it, and different amount of people. And that's all in that standard. So if climate change increases, so will these dikes within the same standard. We just have to work a bit harder. Well, that sounds pretty easy, but it's going to be a hell of a job, since this standard for 2050, as it is, gives us 1,500 kilometers of dike reinforcements to implement in the next 25 years. So that will be a bit of a challenge, given the lack of space, given environmental issues like the nitrogen question. Rising costs, but I think we're still on track. But if you look beyond 2050, we might have a lot of a new chapter to write, I think. Sea level, we're basing our dikes on, will be raised somewhere between 80 centimeters and 1.20 meters in the year 2100. But that's on a really mid scenario. And we're having a look at high-end scenarios as well. And if those occur, we are in a different world, I guess. For the Netherlands, we have to, the problem is not getting the sea out, it's getting the rivers out. So we need pumping stations which don't exist anywhere in the world yet. And we are going to have to build them. But, well, we're planning on that. We have do have some time. I think the issue I worry more about is extreme rain and droughts. Those can happen anywhere, anytime. That's for the extreme rain. And droughts are getting more frequent, even in the Netherlands, where we have a lot of fresh water supply from the River Rhine. But there's the salination problem. So, well, we do have a lot to do. But the good thing is we're already thinking about it. Yeah, that's it, I think.
Maybe one quick follow-up question, which is, so the kind of core task, as I see it as an outsider of the Delta program, has really focused on water and dikes and big infrastructure, but some of the tasks you describe are, well, they're they're stretching the horizon of what you traditionally do, and they're increasingly asking the question of collaboration, right, with different sectors, also the private sector. And within that puzzle, how is that going? How do you and the Delta program find that that journey of incorporating more perspectives, public, private, more sectors into the conversation about the future? I think it's worth commenting on it a little bit because it connects to the overall planetary health theme, finding those joint understandings, narratives, values, etc. How is that going?
I think you're absolutely right about that. As we say, the water is crawling upon the land. For instance, the river needs more space, so it's an urban planning question in the end, not just water-based. We cannot solve every water problem within the water system. We need to rethink the way we build our houses, where we build them, and I think as well the way we try to frame the rivers. They need to be more. Sometimes they have to overflow a little bit, so it raises the river bed. It's just getting too much erosion right now. So there's a problem there. And for other collaborations as well, we try to connect with financial sector more and more. And we do have a working title, the Netherlands AAA Climate Resistance. I think that's what we
use. Climate proof,
climate resilience.
Yeah.
And the AAAs are like, it's not only our financial market status, it's also we use it as a metaphor for the way we try to work with it. We've got like the preventional layer, the risk reduction layer if something might happen, and then recovery as quick and fast as possible. And that's where you guys come in. And I think we need those collaborations more and more often.
I think that's a super good segue to Harold. So around the world, certainly where I'm from, which is Florida, I watch on the news, and I've studied for over a decade the gradual retreat of private insurers from catastrophe risk in vulnerable places. But here we see private insurers step up also on the topic of flood, saying, hang on, maybe we can play a greater role in this conversation. I think that's novel. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about why that is and what that looks like.
Yeah, we are heading in the opposite direction. And that is because in 1953 we had a major flood disaster. Because that area in the province Zeeland was not covered enough. So all the natural circumstances came all at once at one place. And that resulted in the famous Delta works, but also the government decided that a primary breakthrough of the dikes are not covered. But that's not realistic anymore. I think if you would like to cover it through an insurance, this is the moment to do so. Because in a sophisticated country as the Netherlands, we cannot live with the highest protection gap in terms of flood risk. We have the highest protection gap of all the member states in Europe, you know, and it's not a good propaganda. So we would like to change that, but we cannot do it alone. And the need to act upon that is very crucial, because as an insurance company, we are not only dealing with climate mitigation, climate adaptation, but also climate suffering. We already see the consequences of climate change in our files. And that means that we are taking now, we see the consequences of the decisions we made in terms of construction or water management, which has been taken 30 years ago. In a very simple example, in the western parts, the surface is completely different and needs a high surface water level. Otherwise, a lot of cities will face pole rot. And many houses are built on pole. So they need a high level of surface. But if the level is too low, you create pole rot and it will harm the foundation of the houses. And that will cost you 60,000 to 100,000 to repair it. And this is not covered by an insurance. And the same counts in the other part of the Netherlands, where the surface is based on sand, And there, the water level needs to be more higher in terms of drought. But what you get there is that now appears all types of water straits because the basements are not protected very well. And then they call the insurance company, and we have to say again, pardon me, it's not covered because it's a lack of construction. So this is not acceptable in a way and in an area where we are facing more and more of these circumstances which are related to climate change. So we have several types of water damage, and each and every type of water damage we have to help those vulnerable regions, those vulnerable communities, and those vulnerable sectors who cannot help themselves. So that's why we are trying to adapt our policy conditions in such a way that we are stimulating all the members, we call it members, all the members to act in the right direction. So if you have some adaptative measures in your garden or in your environment, you get a reward by a reduction of the premium. And the same counts if you have a more sustainable home, residential home with a low energy price, you should get a reward for that in your policy conditions. We're not there yet, but on sector base we are trying to achieve and to push the members in the right direction. So it's helping those people who need the help the most and cannot help themselves. And the same counts for this huge approach of the breakthrough of the primary diet, which is indeed one of the biggest catastrophes we can imagine. So now we are thinking of a similar approach, which is now in place for terrorism. We have a national reinsurance company for terrorism, and we are heading and we are trying to hope it in the next government period to achieve a similar equivalent of a national reinsurance company for flood risk. Because the capacity is there, it can be covered, and we can take our policyholders in that direction, that they are aware of what the damage will be and what they can get as a refund, as a recovery, because the way it is organized now, it is still depending on the Damage Act compensation in the Netherlands, and it should be activated by a minister, and it's politically colored, so and this is a very undesirable, very uncertain circumstances. And I fully also agree that another sustainable climate-related challenge is drought, in combination with extreme rainfall, because the period of drought followed by extreme rainfall is causing a lot of damage. And we noticed that already in Copenhagen. You probably remember this cloudburst in 2011, 150 millimeters in 2 hours. So it was a really wake-up call for Copenhagen, and it nearly hit the Netherlands. It was just 1 hour later or 1 hour sooner, and it should have hit Amsterdam or Rotterdam. It was not in place, we were just lucky. But this political urgency, which is now acting in the Netherlands, there is a lack of urgency on acting on these challenges, and make ourselves become more climate resilient, and that means we suffer less. We know in our files how bad this suffering can be.
Thanks, Harold. I see the time, and we've got just a few minutes left. Hielke, what do you think, looking from your perspective, is enough private capital available, and is it set up in a way that solves the needs that you think are most urgent as a bank? So what do you see?
Yeah, so I think the size of investments needed can be covered with the financial system we have. I don't think that's any issue. I think we are used to much larger sizes of investments in water infrastructure. The Delta works are a good example. I think the challenges are more in, well, the non-financial aspects, some social aspects such as let's say, lack of public support for increased taxation. The regional water authorities are a democratic institution, but not very politic. So it will be a challenge for them to convince the public that taxation needs to increase. There might arise some solidarity issues between different regions, depending on, well, what catastrophes might be ahead. And maybe, let's see, lastly, more of a spatial aspect. We need different type of adaptation measures, which just require different funding mechanisms or revenue streams. So, for instance, the object level or building level adaptation measures really need to be financed in a different way than the large-scale infrastructure that we are typically used to in the Netherlands.
Yeah, I think that's a journey that many institutions are on right now. I want to give the closing word to Siobhan. So you work also in Rotterdam, not far from here, in a community that is outside of the dikes, which is unusual. So they're living in the middle of the big river, already getting their feet wet every so often. And as we talk about the kind of growth of, we're in the season, the growing role of public but also private finance in this discussion, what do we need to be mindful of when we think from the neighborhood level?
So very briefly, I think one of the things that strikes me in working with a community, an NGO organization, it's an island in the middle of the Maas River that is what we call beyond the dikes, okay? So several times a year it will have relatively minor flooding from a Dutch point of view, okay? But one of the things that strikes me, and particularly in terms of financing, right, and discussions around financing, is that in the reports that I read, like say official reports and in academic studies, we very often focus on kind of sectoral level, responses. The insurance industry should do this, the private sector needs to do this, banks need to do the other, or it's at the individual level, it's the property owner, the homeowner, etc. And I think sometimes what's forgotten is like the community and the neighborhood there. And I say this because in my work with the community, and I'm learning hugely from them on this, there is such a wealth of solutions, really innovative thinking about how at community level and neighborhood level, people, individuals can organize and work together. But then equally so to address those bigger financing questions. And I'll just finish as an example. So in the island, there is social housing, and then there is private, housing. A large apartment block has been built relatively recently. And so the community group said, wouldn't it be great if we could just put solar panels over the roof of the private apartment block? And then one of the things they have in the Netherlands is energy cooperatives, which is a legal entity that they perhaps don't have in other countries. And couldn't we use the money from that to try and subsidize the energy costs of those that are living in social housing, right? And then straight away, from somebody with a legal head on, you're dealing with, that's private property, and then how are we going to do this? And then you need to set up thing and and how are we going to get a contract between the private property owner and all the rest of it there, right? So I think the challenge is back on us to come up with the kind of solutions to this, and in that way it expands, I think, the range of financial options that we can think about beyond just private insurance, public funding.
I think that's beautifully said. And now we're going to transition to some questions. So thanks so much, Siobhan, Martijn, Harold, Hielke. Very interesting. Thanks.
Great. Is it possible to bring our earlier panelists, who I think are still on Zoom, if they can come back onto the screen? That would be great. Hi, Andy. This first question was framed, I think, for this initial panel, but I also would open it up to all of you as well. But the question is, if development banks still mostly operate within a growth-driven capitalist logic, can they truly finance planetary health, or are they reinforcing the same extractive model under a green label? Welcome back. Just thought I would give you a softball question when you guys when you rejoin the call.
Sorry, I actually I could only hear half of your message or your question, so do you mind repeating it?
Sure. The question is, if development banks still mostly operate within a growth-driven capitalist logic, can they truly finance planetary health, or are they reinforcing the same extractive model under a green label?
Easy question. So I think we have to sort of start with the premises that most development banks are, at the outset demand-driven, in the sense that, the members, we are a bank at this pure definition, in the sense that, it's demand driven by the country's need of what they need in terms of different types of infrastructure, different types of projects. So I think the real premise here is that we need to see more countries wanting to take more complex types of investments that I was speaking about before. And I think that comes from really driving a conversation that goes beyond the sort of lending and, working together with different partners, really trying to figure out, how to make the complex more sort of bankable in a way of incorporating different approaches to these projects. So I think it is what we make it all together, and of course a lot of countries, especially countries that are in need for economic growth or in need for development. Many times ministries of finance do look at, what are the projects that will provide them a return on investment. So I think we also have to move away from that paradigm shift and try to really incorporate more long-term sustainable thinking that really is grounded in the fact that health, nature, ecosystems are essential investments. They are not expenditures. And we are in different stages with different countries in that conversation. But I would say overall that there's absolutely an opportunity to maximize all of these projects as well, to incorporate a better approach on how we think about the intersection between climate, nature and health in all projects, not only health projects or climate projects. So I think there's a real opportunity.
Can I add something to it? Yeah, before I joined Unive, I worked for NN Group, which is also operating in a shareholders' value. And what will help in this context are three things. The quality of the shareholders. If the shareholders are also very much driven by the challenges related to sustainability and climate change and biodiversity in particular, that will help. But also will help is a CEO, which is very much in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement and Montreal. And third, and that is last but not least, what also might help is that if you speak about the remuneration of the board members, it should not only be driven by financial indicators like turnover or profit or Solvency II ratio, but also by non-financial indicators. How much have you contributed to the decrease of the CO2? How much have you contributed to develop products which are becoming more sustainable and are helping the society? So this is not financially driven, but sustainability driven, and that might help also.
If I can also add, I think even in degrowth scenarios, we will still need to have some sort of debt financing, right? So if a country, for instance, pays off a large part of its debt, I think it's a good thing not to take on as much debt per se, but it would also be a shame if there's no debt available for new or different types of investment, which are also necessary for planetary health in the future.
Okay, next question. Where are the possibilities now of forgiving developing nations' debts? And alternatively, what are the possibilities for highly indebted LMICs, low and middle income countries, to collectivize and demand better terms for debt forgiveness? So if one country defaults, then that's a problem for that one country. But if they all default, refuse, then that's the lender's problem.
I can jump in. I think debt forgiveness as a whole, it's very hard to find traction for that, at least within the most recent discussions on international financial institutions reforms and, for example, around Seville, what I mentioned, the Financing for Development Conference. There are many arguments against and in favor of debt forgiveness, but I think what we need is more innovation like the one that Vera described and the examples that I mentioned around debt swaps, like how we create financial mechanisms that reduce foreign debt, but at the same time comes with commitments for countries to take on either conservation, environmental, health objectives, and at the same time support countries to fix the structural issues that are keeping those countries highly indebted. Otherwise, we will just be, putting a Band-Aid when there's a bigger underlying root cause on the structural economic challenges that a country faces. So I think one solution around this whole issue that we've been discussing on how to de-risk investment towards countries has to do with figuring out what to do with the high levels of debt of countries, but it's not the only thing. I think, again, just as I mentioned that there needs to be a whole of society approach to these challenges, we also need a very creative thinking around how are we going to finance these issues. And the issue around debt, I think on an ideal world, we might think, well, let's just take down the debt on many of the, at least the lower income countries around the world. But I don't see that taking much traction around financial institutions. I think we have to be more creative, for example, around the debt for nature swaps and those type of mechanisms that, yes, they reduce the debt burden, but it also comes with creative and innovative solutions that are integrating planetary concepts, planetary health concepts into policies. Again, I know it's a very complicated question. It has been debated for a long time, but I think potentially and politically viable solutions will come from those creative financial mechanisms and not just from a discussion of let's erase the debt of every country and then move forward. I don't think that's going to get much traction, at least at the discussions that have been happening recently.
Yeah, can I add something to it as a mutual insurance company? What I learned is you should not wait about the government because there are so many uncertainties you have to deal with. Be great and act small. So if you, what Unive is doing now is facilitating the setup of very small cooperations in those neighborhoods who are the challenges the most, because there are neighborhoods, even in the Netherlands, who are facing all the problems because they can't read the financial policies. They don't have the financial capacity to solve the problems, so they have to adapt themselves, their behavior, or face the consequences. And also they are living in an environment which are extremely vulnerable for heat, for extreme rainfall, for other types of water damage. So if you start up by creating a cooperation, and which should be led by also the members of that neighborhood, so they are in charge of the agenda, they only need some facilitation how to set up this cooperation. And then you can act very small and you make use of all the positive attitudes which are already available in these small neighborhoods. So that's also a possibility.
Thank you, Sedina, thanks, Zach, and thank you to all the speakers for this insightful session. A round of applause. Please don't leave the stage because we have a picture. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I know we all need coffee because that was not the last session of the day. But I have some announcements. So at 4, we will have the other 3 parallel sessions, but also we have a session of lightning talks, which are the top-rated abstracts of this event of FAM 2025, in room 528 at the 4th floor. But also the poster pitch sessions all around Jurianse foyer, so where we are having lunch at the 1st floor, and in the Van de Mandele So don't miss the opportunity also to go to these sessions. And finally, a reminder, you know that this evening is the evening of our social dinner at 7:30 p.m. at Jack Rotterdam for those who bought already the tickets, because unfortunately we are full, or luckily we are full. So see you later. But now we have our meditation session with Orla before the coffee.